in and out of the Beltway. From large cities to small towns to the rural heartland. From sea to shining sea. This is Wehman, Brunson, and Vernuccio. Inside the News.
Welcome back to this week's edition of Inside the News. Glad to have you with us. Another busy week. I say that every week, but every week is just as busy as the week before, but it's going to continually getting busier. I'll let Ben, our resident author, correct me on my grammar there as we get closer to the election. Speaking of Ben, how you doing today, Ben?
I am doing great, Guy. It is a pleasure once again to be with you and Frank.
Oh, yeah, it really is. I look forward to this. It's almost the highlight of the week. I mean, there's other things that I kind of look forward to, too, but I love chatting with you guys. Frank, how you doing up there? And what state are you into this week?
The state of despair, once again, New York. And, of course, we have now gone through the entire summer. We have not had one slow news week, let alone one slow news day.
Oh, my goodness. And you got de Blasio, and we focus on the word blah. All right. Protests turn to physical harm, and we're watching the protests all around the country, and it is really disturbing. 77% of Americans say that they are disgusted by what is going on with these protests going into physical harm and Antifa and everything. And we're going to talk about the Joe Biden response and all that later in segment 3. But the physical harm that's being given, and they actually shot a Trump protester out there in Portland, Frank.
Yeah, I want to say his name, Aaron J. Donaldson. And I want to say it again, Aaron J. Donaldson. The reason I'm saying that name over and over again is because the press, for the most part, is not. Unlike a George Foster or any of the other people killed in riots or the incidents that began riots, the press has really shied away from emphasizing this incident at all. Indeed, in the aftermath of the Antifa attack on this Trump supporter, shot simply because he is a Trump supporter, the media, for the most part, gave out reports that seemed to imply that this was just a melee that occurred at a disorderly event in the city of Portland. In fact, it was an assassination, intentional assassination of someone simply because he was a Trump supporter. It's similar to the attacks all over the United States on people simply for wearing a MAGA hat or some kind of identifying button that says that they are simply not left-wing Democrats. We have to understand what this is all about. This is not politics as usual. This is intentional assaults on people for their political points of view. And it's not just the actions of a mob. We have people like Representative Maxine Waters, who actually encourages people to confront Trump cabinet members at gas stations and at restaurants and assault them. This is something we have not seen before in the United States.
You know something, Ben, what occurred to me as Frank was just finishing up there is that Martin Luther King would be appalled at what's going on right now.
Well, he certainly would be, but what is happening is the inevitable outcome of allowing this to go on ad infinitum, allowing chaos in the streets, taking your police off the streets, telling police to allow rioters to control the streets night after night in cities like Portland. Seattle went down this road and they got chopped until that turned into rape and murder and other chaos. And finally they cracked down there. It's a long past time for Portland to crack down and take control of the streets. But we've been talking about this, and what has happened so far is, in my opinion, quite limited, as horrible as it is. In the case in Portland, it does appear that Mr. Danielson, who went by a pseudonym Jay Bishop, and Donald Trump actually tweeted the name Jay Bishop, but his real name is Aaron Danielson. He was hunted. He was identified. He and his buddy, they were on the streets alone. They were identified as Patriot Prayer members by their hats. And the one individual, Mr. Michael Reinhold, I guess that's how you pronounce his name, gunned the guy down intentionally. And it is interesting to me that this is a few days later at this point, and Mr. Reinhold is yet to be arrested and charged, to my knowledge. He's being, quote unquote, investigated. It is, again, seems like an interesting, different standard of justice being applied right now.
You know something, Frank, as Ben was talking there, and Antifa, and we've mentioned this before, and the president has mentioned this. This is a criminal organization. Can they actually be prosecuted under the RICO statute?
It's an interesting concept. I think something else is at play, though, and I think Antifa should be prosecuted under terrorist statutes. We have to realize that what's going on in Portland, what's gone on in other American major cities are not protests, they're not riots, they are a rebellion. Were I the president or the attorney general, I would use the insurrectionist act actually to begin process of doing things. I would declare the city of Portland in a state of rebellion against the United States government. I would bypass the mayor and the governor of the state because a rebellion is not a crime. It is something else entirely. And I believe that the federal government has the right to send in troops to suppress a rebellion. This is no different than the Confederacy breaking away from the United States in 1861.
You know, that's an interesting concept here, and I think Frank is spot on here, Ben. And you got to give credit to Donald Trump, President Trump, for showing great restraint and not saying we're going to clean this thing up. But it's been 90 days in Portland, and there's going to come a time when the president's just going to say, okay, we've had enough. I've had enough. The country's had enough. We're going in and cleaning it up. What do you think about that, Ben?
Well, this may be one area where, as much as I'm generally support Donald Trump, he may be playing a little bit of politics here, because the withholding that harsh measure of invoking the Insurrection Act and sending in federal troops and federalizing control of a city like Portland is made it quite clear what the ramifications are of Democratic governors and mayors who allow this to go on night after night and tell the police to back off and give them marching orders that basically allow rioters to control everything. So I'm afraid that what is likely to happen is that there won't be an escalation, as Frank said, save two events. And one is the election day passing, which probably gives Trump a freer hand, and or the level of violence really escalating to a point where it creates an outcry across the country. And that's the type of thing we've been talking about for a long time, which is something much more than one guy being targeted, where a group of people armed with AR-15s or AK-47s goes in on either side. It could be a group from the right or the left attacking or targeting the other group, but really guns down a lot of people. And that is on the table. And that's the one thing I'm concerned about. And I think at that point, the outcry will be so sufficient that the government will go to the next level, which is to use the powers they have through the Insurrection Act to take charge.
Frank, the Insurrection Act reminds me of May 4th, 1970, I believe it was, the May 4th at the Kent State, the National Guard, when, they tried to put down the protesters there, and four students were killed. And I think Donald Trump wants to avoid that. But as Ben pointed out, this is far greater. But that people keep going back to that May 4th incident at Kent State University, Frank.
Well, the difference, of course, is that at Kent State, the students were unarmed. You are now dealing with an armed insurrectionist group. Both Antifa and Black Lives Matter have not shied away from either the execution of or the advocacy of violence to perpetuate their mission. That's the crucial difference between what went on in the Vietnam era. Look, this is not a San Francisco summer of love. You don't have hippies with flower power and music playing out in the public square and talking about protest and putting flowers in the guns of National Guardsmen. You're talking about armed militant groups talking about the militant overthrow of local authority. There's a significant difference here. Because the media has been so partial on the side of these agitators. They have not displayed the true extent of the violence involved. That has given the public from coast to coast a wholly false reading of how serious the situation actually is.
Wasn't the Seattle mayor the one who said this is the summer of love?
Exactly.
I mean, so in other words, the very thing that you just said, it's like, okay, we're going to make this a summer of love, but it's turned into the summer of violence. Ben Pelosi, and she's really off the rails here. She called Donald Trump the enemy of the state. Oh my goodness.
Well, it strikes me as desperation, and there is a bit of panic you see setting in among the Democratic Party as they realize how weak their candidate is. And I think Kamala Harris is proving to be no real benefit at all to the Democratic ticket. Mm-hmm. She's a weak campaigner. She was a terrible campaigner when she was running under her own name and went nowhere during the Democratic primaries. So Joe Biden, his most consequential decision yet was his pick as VP, made a bad pick. And the Democratic Party is really moving into panic mode at this point. You see it in Nancy Pelosi's attack. That really is, well, it may not be unprecedented, but I can't think of the last time that the Speaker of the House called the sitting president the enemy of the state and essentially advocated for the armed removal of the President of the United States. It's probably been quite a long time since that last happened.
I don't want to jump ahead of the gun here, Frank, but Ben opened the door here about Kamala Harris. And Amy Klobuchar, as maybe boring as she is, she would have been a great campaigner, and she was not afraid to get into the issues on campaigning, even for her own behalf in the primary.
I continue to be amazed at the selection of Joe Biden's vice presidential candidate. She comes from a state the Democrats are almost sure to win. She does not bring any gravitas to the ticket. So I don't really understand what Kamala Harris's attraction was to the Biden campaign. I think it was a miscalculation of epic proportions. Whether there are internal politics within the Democratic Party that made Kamala Harris an inevitable candidate, I'm not privy to. But certainly she was a terrible choice. She brings nothing to the ticket. In terms of optics, several women who I've asked what they thought of Kamala Harris, both on Democratic and Republican females, have said that she comes across as very smug and arrogant and turns off other women. So I don't think she's an asset in terms of her gender either. So it was a baffling choice, just one more example of the ineptness of the Biden camp.
You know, outside of Hillary Clinton getting her nose into everything, Ben, and I'm going to bring up her name, but we've got this congressman out there in Hawaii who might have been a good choice.
Well, of course, Tulsi Gabbard is who you're referring to.
Oh, it's not. See, I've been banned from saying her name on the air.
Yes, but she is completely out of touch with where the Democratic Party is.
And Kamala Harris isn't?
And Kamala Harris was picked because the party has gone to the extreme left.
Okay.
It is controlled by AOC at this point, and the squad and Bernie Sanders. When you see Bernie Sanders full of joy and ebullience at the Democratic National Convention because his entire platform that he's been advocating for all his life has essentially been adopted officially by the party as its agenda. And he has stated as much. You know how far left the party has gone. Barack Obama from 2008 would be a far right-winger in the Democratic Party if you go back to his policies back then. So the party has moved so far left that, you know, Biden was forced to pick someone like Kamala Harris, who is acceptable to the left wing of the party. And it's a disaster, and it's going to be a disaster. And we can get into the polling later and what's going on, but it is not shaping up very well for the Democrats at this point.
A final thought here, Frank. Should President Trump win, and what Ben is saying is true, that their platform is a total Bernie Sanders, and Bernie Sanders is then shut down on that platform, does that put this thing to rest about Bernie Sanders and socialism in this country?
No, I think one of the big stories after this election is going to be the civil war within the Democratic Party. There has got to be some pushback on the part of older line, more traditional Democrats against the left-wing takeover of their own party. Remember, the Democratic Party used to concentrate very heavily on blue-collar workers. Their entire platform is about as antagonistic towards the interest of blue-collar workers as you can possibly get. Contrast that with Donald Trump, whose fight against China really is a gift to blue-collar workers. So at some point, the Democrats have got to acknowledge and accept the defection of a key portion of their own support or revamp their party entirely. The Bernie Sanders types won't give up without a fight. So that civil war within the Democratic Party, I think, is almost an inevitability.
All right, we're going to leave it there. We're going to come back. We're going to talk about North Korea. We're going to talk about China, the Hoover Report. And we're not talking about the Hoover Dam out there in the West. This is Inside the News, and you're listening to us on our affiliates across the country and on AUN TV. We'll be back.
You're listening to Wehman, Brunson, and Vernuccio, Inside the News.